אוקיי, אז ערב טוב לכולם, אני מניח שאנשים עוד יצטרפו, הנה מצטרפים, אנחנו נעשה את האינטרו בעברית, אחר כך נעבור לאנה שתעשה את ההרצאה מן הסתם באנגלית, אז אני ככה רץ מהר על הדברים הרגילים, אנחנו חלק מפס, מי שלא רשום מוזמן להירשם, אנחנו נמצאים באתר של מיטאפ, יש פה את הלינק ואת ה-QR קוד, מוזמנים לצלם ולהירשם גם לשם, אבל אם אתם פה אז כנראה שאתם הגעתם משם. קבוצה בפייסבוק, למי שבמקרה לא מכיר, זמן להצטרף, דיונים ועדכונים וכל מה שקורה בתחום בקבוצה בפייסבוק. יש את הקבוצה שרונן אריאלי מוביל, הפס גלובל היברו, וירטואל גרופ, גם שם יש וובינרים והרצאות מדי פעם, אז מוזמנים גם לעקוב אחרי זה. יש לנו את ערוץ היוטיוב, כל מה שאנחנו עושים פה מוקלט ועולה לשם, יש שם כבר היסטוריה מאוד יפה של הרצאות מאוד מאוד טובות, ואפשר גם כמובן לעשות סאבסקרייב ולקבל עדכונים ברגע שאנחנו מעלים הקלטה חדשה, ורדיו SQL סרבר. אני ואיתן בלומין, פעם בחודש מוצאים תוכנית, יש פה את הלינק לתוכנית בעברית, יש גם תוכנית באנגלית, .com בסוף, מוזמנים גם על זה לעקוב ולהקשיב לפודקאסטים, משהו כמו חצי שעה 40 דקות כל תוכנית כזאת. אלה פחות או יותר הערוצים שלנו בקהילה. יש את Virtual Pass Summit, כמו שאתם בטח יודעים כבר כולכם, בתחילת נובמבר, כתוב שם למעלה, 10-13 בנובמבר, האירוע כנראה הכי גדול בעולם בתחום הזה של המייקרוסופט דאטה פלטפורם, המון מסלולים, המון הרצאות, יש פריקון, טריינינג סשנס של יום שלם, הרבה כאלה גם כן במקביל, יש הרבה מתוך מה לבחור, יש גם המון מתוכננים, המון דברים מסביב של נטוורקינג, צ'אטים כאלה שאפשר להצטרף אליהם בכל מיני נושאים, כל מיני פעילויות, אמנם הכל וירטואל, אבל פס באמת עושים המון מאמצים בשביל להפוך את זה לכנס עם אווירה, עם תחושה כמה שיותר של מעבר לעוד וובינר. יש פה קוד הנחה, כשאתם נרשמים, אז תכניסו את הקוד הזה, תקבלו $50 הנחה ברג'יסטריישן, אז למה לא? במסגרת פס יש וירטואל גרופס לפי נושאים, דיברתי קודם על הגלובל היברו וירטואל גרופס, יש פה רשימה של כל ההרצאות שהולכות לקרות בקרוב, ויש פה את הנושאים, אז למשל יש את ה-Cloud ויש ה-Availability, Virtual Group, ויש עוד כל מיני. אני אחר כך אפרסם את המצגת הזאת, תוכלו לעבור על הכל, או כמובן פשוט תיכנסו לאתר של פס, תירשמו, אפשר לעשות סאבסקרייב לכל אחד מה-Virtual Groups האלה, ולקבל עדכונים ברגע שיש הרצאות חדשות. הנה, אפשר לראות פה הרצאה של אנה, הרצאה שהיא תעביר היום, אז יהיה אותה גם ב-28 באוקטובר, במסגרת ה-Cloud Virtual Group, אבל אנחנו מקבלים אותה אצלנו, שלנו. ויש פה עוד ועוד ועוד כאלה, יש גם Virtual Group חדש, Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, Virtual Group חדש עכשיו בפס, וההרצאה הראשונה הולכת להיות מחר בעצם, 22 באוקטובר, כל מה שקשור לנושא הזה של Diversity ו-Inclusion, אז כל מי שמתעניין בתחום ויש לו מה לתרום ורוצה להיות חלק, מוזמנים להירשם גם לזה, ולהיות בהרצאות האלה. SQL Saturdays זה עוד איזשהו מיזם של פס, במקור מדובר על אירועים מקומיים, שמארגנים אותם מתנדבים מקומיים בכל מיני מקומות בעולם, גם אנחנו בישראל, SQL Saturday ישראל, כבר רץ כמה שנים ברציפות, זה יום שלם של כמה טרקים במקביל וכו' וכו'. השנה בגלל הקורונה הכל הפך להיות וירטואל, גם SQL Saturdays בכל העולם הפכו להיות וירטואל, כמו שאתם רואים פה זה הכל וירטואל, וזה נחמד כי בעצם פתאום אפשר להשתתף ב-SQL Saturday במלזיה. כנראה שלא הייתם נוסעים למלזיה במיוחד בשביל SQL Saturday, אבל עכשיו אפשר פשוט להירשם, זה הכל בחינם, זה פתוח לקהל הרחב, פשוט להירשם ולקחת חלק באירוע הזה, ומגיעים לאירוע הזה גם מרצים מקומיים מאותם מקומות, וגם מרצים מכל העולם, שוב, זה לא צריך להגיע, אז בטח שזה יותר קל, אז מדברים באמת, זה מרצים מכל העולם, ובעצם זה פותח עוד המון הזדמנויות לטריינינג, ללמידה, לנטוורקינג עם אנשים מכל העולם, דבר מדהים בעיניי. אז אפשר פשוט להיכנס שוב לאתר של פס, לראות את כל האירועים שיש, לבחור, להיכנס, לראות את ההרצאות, את המסלולים, להירשם למה שאתם רוצים, וליהנות מכל הטוב הזה. ברוב המקרים, לא בכולם, אבל ברוב המקרים גם מקליטים, וכל אחד מעלה את זה לערוץ יוטיוב שלו, או לאיפה שזה לא יהיה, אז אפשר לעקוב אחרי הפרסומים, וגם לצפות בהקלטות של מה שלא הספקתם לראות. זה לכבוד אנה, this is for you. Azure SQL Championship, זה קורה החודש, במשך 3 שבועות, זה שיתוף פעולה בין פס לבין מייקרוסופט, בעצם לחסות כל הסיפור הזה של Azure SQL, שזה מה שגם אנה תדבר עליו היום. למי שלא מכיר, יש איזושהי תחרות, מטרה היא ללמוד בצורה כיפית דרך משחק כזה, אז יש גם בכל שבוע יש איזשהו טסט שבועי, שצריך להגיש אותו ובודקים אותו, וגם כל יום יש קוויז יומי שאפשר לענות עליו, ויש לידרבורד וכו' וכו' וכו'. מומלץ, אם אתם לא שם, עדיין אפשר להיכנס, אפשר גם לענות על השאלות, על המבחן, כאילו, על הצ'אלנג', סליחה, משבוע שעבר והשבוע. תיכנסו, תהיו שם. I just explained everything in Hebrew. How does it sound? אוקיי.
Sounds great.
קצת על אירועים שקורים פה, אז האירוע הקודם שהיה לנו, למיטאפ שלנו, זה, אני דיברתי על Extend Events, מי שהיה, חשוב מאוד להכיר Extend Events, אם אתם צריכים לעשות Monitoring Troubleshooting ל-SQL Server, אתם צריכים להכיר Extend Events, אז הייתה הרצאה על זה ב-29 בספטמבר, יש כמובן את ההקלטה, אז מי שלא היה מוזמנים להיכנס ללינק, ומשם להגיע ליוטיוב ולראות את ההקלטה. מה יקרה בקרוב? מחר, אני מפרסם את זה פשוט כי אני מרצה שם, אז מי שרוצה, אז תדעו מה אני עושה, אז אני מחר מרצה במיטאפ שנקרא Junior Developers, כמו שזה נשמע, למפתחים צעירים, ואני הולך לדבר איתם על כל מיני Developer Tips, בעיקר על שימוש בפונקציות, ב-TSQL, ונושא של Table Variables, לא Temporary Tables, קצת אינדקסים, כל מיני דברים טובים כאלה, אז מי שרוצה לקחת חלק להצטרף מוזמן, שוב, מיטאפ פתוח בחינם, כמובן תירשמו, זה יקרה מחר. יש את גרובאי, שבוע הבא. גרובאי זה אירוע מדהים בעיניי, מה שיפה באירוע הזה, בכנס הזה, זה שזה קורה, אני חושב, פעמיים בשנה, או משהו כזה, ומה שיפה בזה זה שזה אירוע דמוקרטי לחלוטין, זה היחיד שאני מכיר בשוק, זה לגמרי דמוקרטי, אין אף אחד מהמארגנים שמחליט מה יקרה שם, יש שלב שבו כל מי שרוצה יכול להגיש אבסטרקט ולהציע הרצאות, והכל מפורסם, ואז יש שלב שכולם יכולים להצביע, ואז פשוט המערכת בוחרת לפי מקסימום הצבעות את האג'נדה, מי ייכנס לזה, וזה מדהים בעיניי, כי פשוט נותנים לאנשים לבחור את מה שמעניין אותם. אז האירוע הקרוב יקרה שבוע הבא, זה במשך יומיים, 27 ו-28 באוקטובר, שוב תיכנסו לאתר, תירשמו, תראו מה יש שם. יש לי את הכבוד, בחרו בהרצאה שלי, אז אני מעביר שם גם כן הרצאה, על איך לעבוד עם טבלאות גדולות ב-SQL Server 2019, יש גם הרצאה של אנה, אם אני לא טועה. אנה, do you have a session in Group as well? I think so, right? Yes, אוקיי. אז יש לכם גם את אנה שם, וגם רונן אריאלי שהזכרתי קודם, גם לו יש הרצאה שם, יש לנו ייצוג ישראלי יפה באירוע הקרוב, אז זה יקרה בגרובאי. במסגרת הוובינרס במדרה, אנחנו עושים פעם בחודש, כל יום שלישי הראשון בחודש, יש לנו וובינר בכל מה שקשור לדאטה פלטפורם, שמישהו מהצוות שלנו במדרה מעביר, אז בשלישי בנובמבר, יהיה הוובינר הבא, יעביר אותו סגי וקנין מהצוות שלנו על דאטאבייס יוניט טסטינג, שזה נושא מאוד מעניין, מאוד חשוב, לא מספיק מוכר, אז דעתי תהיה אחלה הרצאה, אז אתם מוזמנים להצטרף בשלישי בנובמבר. הזכרנו כבר את Virtual Summit, זה אני פשוט עובר כרונולוגית, אז זה יקרה ב10 בנובמבר, כבר דיברנו על זה, והמיטאפ הבא שלנו, ההרצאה הבאה שלנו, זה הרצאה של עמי לוין, שהייתה אמורה לקרות, וכבר פעמיים היא בוטלה ונדחתה, מכל מיני סיבות, לא ניכנס עכשיו להאשמות, אבל נרשמו מלא אנשים, אני חושב בין ההרצאות שנרשמו להכי הרבה אנשים אי פעם, זה היה קרוב ל200 נרשמים, וזה יפה מאוד, זה מרשים, וזה באמת הרצאה מעולה. לצערנו ברגע האחרון, פעם שעברה, היה שריפות בקליפורניה וזה, ועמי פונה מהבית שלו, וברגע האחרון לא יכל להעביר את ההרצאה, אז לקח לנו קצת זמן וקבענו מחדש. אז החלטנו לחלק את זה, בגלל שעמי יש לו באמת הרבה מה לעשות, וכל הזמן מוסיף וזה, הוא אומר, בוא כבר נעשה את זה בשני חלקים, כי זה כבר נהיה ארוך מדי, אז כל חלק יהיה שעה וחצי, ובעצם זה יהיה ב-18 בנובמבר, וב-25 בנובמבר, יש לנו פארט 1 ופארט 2, אז מי שרוצה מומלץ מאוד, תירשמו לשניהם, תגיעו לשניהם, כמובן שהכל יהיה מוקלט כרגיל וזה, אבל מאוד מאוד מקווה שהפעם זה יקרה ולא יהיה לנו בלטם עוד פעם ברגע האחרון. זהו, וזה מוביל אותנו להרצאה של היום, אנה הופמן, אני מקווה שכולכם מכירים אותה, ממייקרוסופט, עושה, מדברת, נושמת Azure SQL, רואים אותה כמעט בכל מקום, גם ב-Azure SQL Champion שהזכרתי קודם, תראו אותה בגרובאי בשבוע הבא, ועוד בהרבה מאוד מקומות, ואני שמח מאוד שהיא גם באה אלינו, וההרצאה של היום היא בתחום של availability, בעצם הרעיון הוא לקחת את הידע שכבר יש לכם ב-SQL Server, על availability, ואיך לתרגם אותו, ומה אפשר לעשות באז'ור, אבל אני כמובן ניתן כבר לאנה את הבמה. לפני שאנחנו עוברים לאנה, יש שאלות, הערות, משהו? מישהו? סבבה? אז יש? כן? לא. אז אני רק מזכיר, אם יש לכם שאלות תוך כדי הרצאה, תכתבו בצ'אט, אני ככה אבדוק מדי פעם, ואני אעצור את אנה במקומות הנכונים, אני מקווה, ואני אשאל את השאלות האלה. בסוף מאוד מאוד חשוב שזה יהיה אינטראקטיבי, אנה באה להרצות לנו, בשבילנו, בסדר? כל אחד יכול לעשות חיפוש ותמצאו מלא הרצאות מוקלטות, אבל המטרה היא באמת שזה יהיה אינטראקטיבית, שאלו שאלות שיש לכם, דברים שמעניינים אתכם, היא תשמח מאוד לענות, בשביל זה היא פה. וזהו, אני אפסיק לדבר בעברית. אנה, this is enough about Hebrew. I know it sounds weird, right? You have no idea what I'm talking about.
I caught like pieces of it. Like sometimes you hear like availability group or
yeah,
like...
right. I know to put the buzzwords in the right places.
Yes.
Okay, we're on to you. You can share your screen and I will shut up.
I think you also mentioned something about interactive and asking questions.
Right, yeah.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I would love to keep it interactive and ask questions. So I can see like the chat up here. So if anyone has questions, feel free to come off mute or just put it in the chat and I should be able to catch it.
Excellent.
Cool. So thank you guys for being here today, spending time with me. I know there are a ton of virtual things for you to choose from. I'm pretty amazed by the list of topics that are just available for free, happening, it seems like almost at any given time. So it's cool. It's a great time for us to spend learning. But that being said, I know there's a lot of learning to be had. So I appreciate that you're here. Today, I really want to spend time helping translate existing SQL Server knowledge that you have to Azure SQL and how it applies. And today we're really going to be looking at how the SQL Server platform really has a lot of built-in capabilities in Azure SQL. And for some of you, maybe this is a review, maybe you'll learn one or two things. And I'm actually excited because I actually get to pre-announce something in this user group, which I don't think is something that ever happens, but I got permission to pre-announce something that isn't happening till tomorrow. It's not a super exciting feature, but it is something new and exciting and specific to this user group. So that makes it pretty exciting. So the way I'm going to try to look at availability is I first want to give kind of an overview of the Azure SQL options that we have available for you, just so you know kind of where we're focusing today. Then I want to talk about backup restore just a second, even though that's not technically HA, it's more of a DR topic. I do want to just mention it because it kind of relates to the overall picture of your database's availability in Azure. And then we'll kind of go through the level. So we'll start by looking at a local level. What do we do at like a data center level? And then we'll look at zone. And if you're not familiar with availability zones, we're going to learn about them today. We'll look at a zonal level, so kind of one step higher. And then finally, we'll look at kind of a global level. And again, this kind of borders into the DR type of scenarios, but I still thought it was important to include. Then I'll give some recommendations, and then I have so many resources. This is basically one module from this huge set of content that myself and Bob Ward just released recently. So this is going to be the availability module, but there's also modules on performance, security, deployment and configuration, as well as like what to use when and how to piece all these things together. So lots more resources. But again, I hope this is useful and you guys learned something. So let's get right into it. I want to start by talking about what is Azure SQL, just kind of level set what we're going to talk about today. The first deployment offering, you'll hear them called deployment options or deployment offerings, is SQL Server and Azure Virtual Machine. And this is really exactly what it sounds, just any SQL Server, your version, whatever version you like on a virtual machine running in Azure. Again, we have images that support like Linux and Windows and various versions and various licensing SKUs. So there's a lot of flexibility for our infrastructure as a service offering, or IaaS. Now, the potential challenge with IaaS is that you have a lot of control, but with that control, you also have responsibility. So you have to maintain the OS, you have to maintain the SQL Server, you have to be aware of like upgrades and security patches. And the availability, while we'll do things that can help you, a lot of it is really on you to set up your always-on availability group or failover clusters, or however you're going to maintain availability. Now, what we're going to focus on today is more the platform as a service type of offerings, or PaaS services. And probably you all are familiar with these, but basically what we've done is we've abstracted away the OS and for Azure SQL Database, the server itself. And in managed instance, you get basically a managed SQL Server. So we say kind of the best of SQL Server with the best of a managed service. So you're still going to get those instance scoped features like Service Broker, machine learning services, SQL Server agent, those sort of things, you're going to get an Azure SQL managed instance. Now, Azure SQL DB, we abstracted away one level higher. And so you just get a database, but along with that, we have extra intelligence capabilities because we are looking at some of that telemetry. We also have options for serverless, which we'll talk a tiny bit about, and we'll talk a little bit more about Hyperscale as well. Now, depending on how this session goes, if you want to remind me at the end, I just recorded 2 extra demos, so I won't be able to do them live, but I do have them at the very end. If you're like, oh, I really wanted to see a serverless or a Hyperscale demo, we can do that at the end. Okay, so these are our deployment options. Now, again, I know I said this isn't exactly HA, but I did want to touch on what happens to our backups because I get this question a lot. Basically, we do a full database backup once a week with log backups every 5 to 10 minutes and differential backups every 12 to 24 hours. You can configure these backups to be retained for between 1 and 35 days. And if you need longer than that, you can even do long-term retention, which basically allows you to store them up to 10 years. And this means even if you deleted a database like 5 years ago, but for whatever reason, maybe you're being audited, you need to go look at it, you can actually do a point-in-time restore to back 5 years ago if you set up long-term retention. One new thing I also wanted to call out is that we used to store your backups in globally redundant storage by default. So that just means we'd put it in a paired region. So the paired regions I'm most familiar with is East US and West US. So if I deployed a database in East US, it would also have the backup stored in West US. So if for some crazy reason the whole East US region went down, I would be able to do a geo restore because I have a backup sitting in West US anyways. But what we recently added is this idea of doing locally redundant storage or zone redundant storage for your backups, which can help if you have some data sovereignty issues. I'm not sure what the data center region availability is in Israel, but maybe there's one region in Israel and you don't want to have data sitting in another region for your backup, so you could choose to do a locally redundant or a zone redundant. And we'll talk more about zones. But I just wanted to give this little brief overview of backups because it is something that kind of relates to availability and we hear a lot of questions about. So now we're actually going to get into talking about what happens at a local level. And I'm going to look at this on a service tier perspective. So we talked about the deployment offering. So we're going to focus on the vCore service tiers in Managed Instance and SQL Database. And the first one, the most affordable one, the most commonly used one is the general purpose service tier. So I just wanted to spend a few moments talking about that architecture. So what happens if we look over here is, is you have your application. And what's going to happen is your application is going to go to this control ring. So let's say you're just connecting to the server. So we're going to go out to the gateway, and then the gateway is going to redirect us to your primary replica, your primary compute, depending how you set this up. You can set it up to go to the gateway every single time. So you go to the gateway, then you go to the database, go to the gateway, go to the database. That's called the proxy method. So it's always proxied through a gateway. Or you can set up redirect, which basically means you go to the gateway first, and then once you know how to connect, you just go directly to the primary. So that can help with some network latency issues that we see sometimes. So now let's talk about architecture. That's going to be the same for any of the service tiers. So in general purpose, what happens is on this primary replica, we have your TempDB on directly attached SSDs. So your TempDB's right there. Your data and log files are going to be stored in Azure Premium Storage or locally redundant storage. So that's where your data and log files are. So it's similar to what you might see in a Failover Cluster Instance. And then again, of course, I said your backups are by default stored in Azure Standard Storage, which is globally redundant storage. So let's say a failover needs to happen, and there are several reasons that this might happen. Just to back up a second, all of the Azure services, or most of the Azure services, are built on something called Azure Service Fabric. So you can kind of think of it as the backbone of Azure. So one reason we might fail you over is the service fabric might detect, oh, there's something funky with this node or this VM, we need to fail you over. So in this case, what happens is we basically look for a node with spare capacity and we fail you over and we update all these connectors for you. So basically, you're still going to just connect to the application. We'll update that for you. You don't have to change your connection strings or anything. And we'll also redirect this pointer to your data and log files. So this can be pretty quick. It usually takes under 30 seconds, and we'll actually do a little test and see how that works. But as you know, it could be faster because we are having to look with the nodes with spare capacity and then kind of move this over. And in some cases, it can be a size of data type of operation. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, if we step up from that and say, hey, I really can't afford to have 30 seconds of unavailability at any given time. If you guys fail me over, I need it to be really fast. So one option you have for that is the business critical service tier. So this is kind of the next level of service tier. This is a more expensive service tier, but it's really meant for those applications or scenarios where you really need that low latency, fast failover type of workload or response. So as you're familiar with always on availability groups, I'm sure, basically in this method, in this service tier, we have the same sort of setup, except on your primary replica, you have tempdb, of course, but you also have the data and log files. So remember, in general purpose, your data and log files are stored, not in directly attached SSD, but in locally redundant storage. But here in business critical, everything's right there, which makes it, just a little bit faster. And behind the scenes, we actually have an always-on availability group deployed for you. So at any given time, you should have 3 secondary replicas, and we actually let you read from one of those. So this allows you to kind of offset some of your read workload and get more out of your database. And just as before, your backups are stored in Azure Standard Storage. Whether that's globally redundant or geo-redundant or locally redundant or zone redundant is up to you. So now let's talk about Azure Service Fabric, or you can force a failover, decide, okay, we need to fail you over for whatever reason, not healthy, we want to fix it. All we have to do is redirect you to a secondary replica. So it's already up and running. So this process can be very fast. So in my testing, and I've done this quite a few times, it takes between 2 and 8 seconds. It kind of just depends on the luck of the draw from what I've seen. But this can be significantly faster than general purpose. And if you set this up at the highest availability, it equates to 99.995% of availability. And we actually give you an SLA on that. So that amounts to like 26 minutes or less downtime a year. So that's pretty good, I think.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So I thought, we take a look and kind of do an experiment and see how much faster is business critical than general purpose, and is general purpose actually still pretty fast? So let me switch over to my VM. Okay, so a few things going on over here. I'm just going to refresh this really fast, make sure I'm still connected, and then I'll explain what is going on. Okay, so this is Azure Data Studio. Hopefully you all have seen this before. If you've worked with VS Code, we actually forked VS Code. So this looks very similar to it. I'm using some PowerShell notebooks. You can see there are other languages, but I'm just using PowerShell. I'm a big PowerShell person, and I like the Azure CLI as well as the Azure PowerShell modules. They make it really easy to work with the Azure suite of products, and maybe some of you guys have worked with those before. So what I have is on the left, just remember the left is general purpose and the right is business critical. So that's what I have up top. I basically have these PowerShell notebooks. And at the bottom, let me pull this up. What I have is I have 2 ostress commands. Ostress is just going to allow me to create a workload. And one ostress is connecting to a general purpose database, and one is connecting to a business critical database. And these are both AdventureWorks databases, and they're the same database basically. And I'm going to run the same query on each of them. The idea is just to understand if these databases are available. So you see they're both returning 847, which basically means they are available. So again, the right side business critical, left side general purpose, we're going to invoke a failover. You can only do this once every 30 minutes. So if it doesn't work, I can't do it again, but hopefully it works. So I'm basically going to try to do this at the same time, and we'll see what happens. So I'm going to kick this off. And pretty much almost immediately you saw this business critical database became unavailable. The general purpose database followed pretty soon after. And you can see even before I could, well, that's interesting, it became unavailable again. But usually what happens is it does that quick failover, and then we're able to be back up and running. You can see there was some blip there. I'm not sure what happened, but even with that blip involved, the general purpose database had still not quite failed over yet. But now you can see I'm back up and running in less than 30 seconds for both databases. So I think this is really powerful because, one, you saw how fast general purpose could be. And two, you saw how business critical could be. And two, you saw how general purpose is actually still pretty darn fast. It's still under 30 seconds we were able to fail you over. Now, the thing I want to stress here is that I didn't have to configure anything, right? I deployed a business critical database. I deployed a general purpose database. I didn't do any setup. I just get this level of availability. So I think that's pretty cool, pretty powerful. I'm going to share all the scripts so that you guys can try this on your own environments and see what your failover times are like. This is actually the only time I've ever seen, I've probably done this 50 times, I've never seen that blip with business critical. So maybe you can test it out and see what you get.
Anna?
I was going to pause. Yeah, what's up?
In this demo, are you using a managed instance or a single database?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in this demo, I am using a single database, just because it's a little bit less expensive for me to keep both these running all the time. But you should see the same experience in a managed instance as well.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, awesome. And if there are any questions, now is kind of a good time to ask if you have any questions so far.
Probably not.
Okay, we will continue onwards. Okay, so that's business critical general purpose. Now there's one more tier that is available for single database only today. Not yet available in managed instance. It's something we've committed to working on, but we're just not there yet. And that service tier is called Hyperscale. Now, this is a really interesting service tier because what we did is we re-architected SQL Server to be a cloud-born type of product. So what that means is we essentially implemented a very interesting cache layering system, which allows us to not only scale out, but also scale up. So this gets us past what was the previous limit for a database size of 8 terabytes. And now we support up to 100 terabytes, but in theory, that's just a number. We could support, there's nothing stopping us from going higher than this. Whereas with, the 8 terabytes or the 4 terabytes today limits you see, those are, dependent on hardware restrictions. So let's talk a little bit about this architecture. In the top, I know it doesn't look exactly the same as the application in the gateway, but it is the same thing. That's the same thing that happens here in the Hyperscale database. Now, the other thing that you're going to notice is that there's a primary compute. So this is similar to what you've seen in the other service tiers where we're going to point you to this one. But what you can also have is these secondary compute or secondary replicas. You can have up to 4 of them, but you can also have 0 of them. So you can kind of decide what's best for your read workload, because you can read from every single one that you deploy. So it's up to you to decide what's best for your workload, and you can actually dynamically scale up these read replicas and scale them back down when you don't need them anymore. And you can have, like I mentioned, 0. Now, if you think about it, and before we get into the other pieces, if you think about general purpose versus business critical, if you have 0 replicas, you're going to get a similar failover time as you saw in general purpose, because there's nothing like standing by. We are going to have to spin something up for you. Whereas if you have 1 or 2 replicas, after 2, it kind of doesn't affect your availability much more. But if you have 1 or 2, then we can fail you over quickly because, again, it's just a matter of redirection and making sure you're all up to date. So let's talk just a little bit about this architecture. We have the primary compute nodes, which I was talking about, and then we have a layer of page servers. And because the RBPX data cache expands here, that's allowing us to scale out horizontally. And basically, this should be full covering. So what that means is we can put your data files in Azure Standard Storage, and that's okay. They don't need to be like super close by, because we should be able to get everything we need from this page servers level. And we can also do snapshot backups, which is going to allow us to do things like restores that take constant time, which is really interesting, that you could have a really, really large database and then do a restore in, a matter of minutes. Now, one thing that you might have noticed is not here is that we actually pulled out the log service, which is really interesting, because what this means is that the log service is then going to feed the replicas, whether it's in the primary compute or in this page server level. The log service is going to feed them. So this means that transactions can commit when the log service hardens to the landing zone. So it just means it needs to harden here for a transaction to commit. And so that also means that it's not required for one of these secondaries to get that. So we can basically have the log service feed that afterwards. So this is a really powerful technology, really awesome. I think this is the future of Azure SQL. I think you'll see us, kind of deploy this type of architecture everywhere, but not quite there yet. But, this is really interesting. There's lots of deep dives and white papers, which I've linked to in here, so you can read more about this architecture. And now I'm trying something new in these user groups. I'm not sure like how it's going to go, but I basically came up with a few questions just to kind of quiz you, engage you. Maybe it sparks other questions. And this first question is like a little bit tricky. The second question hopefully is a little bit easier. But if you want to participate, what we'll do is you can put your answer to both questions in the chat at the same time. So if you think the answer is D for both questions, you can just put D, and send it as one message. So if you want to take a second to look at the question, give a stab at an answer. No one's judging anyone here, so don't worry about getting it right or wrong. We'll talk about it. But the first question is, which service tier puts the data and log files in Azure Premium Storage? So this is a little bit tricky. Think about the different architectures and where the data and log files reside. So if you think about business critical, where are the data and log files? If you think about general purpose or hyperscale. And then the second question is, which service tier has an always-on availability group deployed behind the scenes? And so that's another question, hopefully is pretty easy for you guys to get. I see Guy has an answer. Thank you for participating. I'm getting mixed reviews from these. Some people are like, I'm not in grade school, please do not show me a quiz. And some people kind of like them, but that's okay. So we'll just kind of talk about the answers. So the answer to the first question, Guy is correct, is general purpose. And if we just flick back briefly, the reason for that is in general purpose, as you see, the data and log files are not directly attached, but they're in Azure Premium Storage. So it is, easily accessible, but not directly attached. In business critical, it's in the primary node. So that's not an option. And the tricky one was Hyperscale, because actually the part of the log service is in Azure Premium Storage, but the long-term log storage and the data files are actually in Azure Standard Storage. So that was just a little trick question just to see. And then the second question, obviously the answer is business critical. We deploy an always-on availability group behind the scenes, and that's the reason that failover you saw in the demo was indeed so fast. So if there's any other questions, feel free to pop them in the chat or come off mute. We're here for you. So if I just wrap up just briefly these service tiers, this is kind of a comparison of all of them. You can see what you get from a readable replica perspective. You can see from a cost perspective, from an IO per second perspective, what you're going to get with the various service tiers. The only thing we didn't talk about is serverless, which is available only in single database and only in the general purpose service tier. This basically allows you to auto scale on a per second basis. between 2 levels of core. So for example, between 1 and 4 cores, you can auto scale between that, and we can actually bill you on a per second basis as opposed to just billing you for a set level of compute, whether or not you use it. So that can be interesting for some workloads. And then we also have the capability for you to set an auto pause delay. So maybe your app only runs during the day and no one uses it at night. You can actually configure it to auto pause, in which case it will shut down and you'll only have access to the storage. You'll only be billed for the storage at that point. And then when you hit the database again, it'll take some time to warm up, but then you can reattach the compute and the storage. I see a question. Do you plan to deploy the feature multi-master that exists in Cosmos? That's a great question. It's a complex issue for us because it doesn't necessarily comply with what you would think for standard relational database principles. That being said, it is something we're actively investigating and working on. I don't think it's something you'll see anytime soon, to be quite frank. But maybe in the next year, you might hear something about it. I can't really comment any further than that, but it is a good question and it is something we get asked a lot. But again, like the issues with things like CRUD and ACID are where, we have to be very careful when we think about doing something like multi-master, especially if this was like for a bank or something where you can't really have these competing transactions. But great question. And if you are interested in learning more, you can ping me and I can try to connect you to see if there's anything private that might be able to be shared, but nothing else from me. Okay, so we've talked about at a local level. The next thing I want to talk about is at a zone level. Now, availability zones are pretty new, so I wanted to talk a little bit about what those are. So what an availability zone is meant to do is protect you from data center outages. I'm just going to animate this slide. This is more of a marketing slide, but I'll kind of explain what it is. So you have a region, and in a region, we have multiple data centers. Now, these data centers could be in the same physical location, just next to each other. They could be in different locations. You don't have visibility into that. But by default, what happens is when you deploy a database, we're going to put everything in one data center. Now, what an availability zone does is it makes it so that a region now has different zones in it. So it's a little more granular. So maybe let's say we have 8 zones in a region now. So if you enable availability zones, we're going to spread your data across your primary or your secondaries, or the ability to connect to the data log files across those zones, across 3 zones, so that if for whatever reason, there's a huge fire and a whole data center goes out, you're still protected because there are other data centers that have your data in it. And you can see some things that make them separate. For example, if they were on the same campus, they would be in different buildings. So independent power, cooling, network, and then we're going to replicate you. So let's talk about where it's available today, and then the new thing that I was talking about that I get to pre-announce here. So today it's available in Business Critical and Premium, which is part of the DTU SKU. We didn't really talk about that, but it is available today for free in these tiers. So if you're running that Business Critical, it's available. And so what you can see how it kind of works, you see these, there's another layer. So before we talked about the gateways and the control rings. Now what we do if you enable availability zones is we actually connect it up using Azure Traffic Manager, and we put a control ring in 3 different availability zones. Now, all of this is abstracted away from you, so you're not having to deploy any of this or manage any of this, but it's good to know that this is how it's working behind the scenes. And so with Business Critical, you'll recall you have your primary with data log TempDB, and then the always on availability group is going to be spread across those 3 zones. Now, like I said, you don't have any visibility into which availability zone something is in. You just know that we have this spread across 3 zones. So this is going to help you be available even in the case that a failover might have to occur. So for example, if all of AZ1, which is availability zone 1, goes down, we can still fail you over to the secondary very quickly, similar to what we saw before. and you can minimize the time that you have that outage.
So today, before this new release, we might have all of the replicas in the same availability zone?
Exactly, yeah. So this has been available maybe for the past year, I want to say. So this is available today, but yeah, if you don't enable this, they would all be in one zone. And what you do when you enable this is we spread it throughout. So that's kind of something that helps. And the new thing is that this used to be only available in Business Critical and Premium, but now, well, actually starting tomorrow, we are making this service available in general purpose. So again, this is going to be a little bit different because as you saw in Business Critical, it's a little bit easier because we already have these replicas for you. So we just spread them out. With general purpose, since it's more of like a failover cluster instance, what we do is we spread your data and log files across the availability zones, as well as your backups are already globally redundant or zone redundant or locally. But anyways, your backups are already redundant. But what we have done is we've taken the data and log files and spread them out. So if you need to do some sort of failover, we can fail you over, similar to failover cluster instance with shared type of storage, but we can fail you over, and that's something that's possible, whereas before that wouldn't really be possible because your data, log files, and TempDB were all sitting in one zone. Now, I will be honest about a few things. Since this is so new, I'm not exactly sure what the pricing is going to look like. Since we'll announce this in preview, sometimes preview pricing is different. Whereas with Business Critical, it's just free because you're already paying for this kind of setup. But here, there's a little more that we have to do. So I'm not sure what the pricing is going to look like. But this is interesting and kind of cool to get to pre-announce something like this.
Yeah.
I also don't know the exact impact on the SLA. So our SLA is basically an agreement from us saying, hey, we guarantee that your database is going to be available at least this much of the time. And if it's not, you can actually get a service credit. So basically a refund in a certain outlook to kind of make up for that. So that's how sure we are. And you can see, like, I'm not sure what the SLA for this multi-zone general purpose database is, if it would be 99.995 or somewhere in between, but it's definitely going to increase your availability. The other interesting thing to notice is this hyperscale thing. I mentioned you get to choose how many replicas, and based on the number of replicas you have is going to help your availability even from an SLA perspective. So I'll take a breath and see if anyone has any questions or comments.
Nice.
Cool. Okay, we will continue onward. So we talked about local and we talked about zone. Now the next thing is geo. So maybe you want to go a little bit further. Maybe you're looking for a little bit more than HA. Maybe you're looking for read scale. Maybe you're looking for more DR type of things. Now there are two options we have for you. There's geo-replication and auto-failover groups. Now I kind of wanted to compare and contrast these architectures. So the first one is geo-replication, and then I also have a table which can help kind of compare. And so what you see is you basically set up geo-replication, and you have your read-write and your read-only endpoints. And basically what's happening is you have two separate servers or more, because you can actually have multiple geo replicas, and these are servers you connect to independently. So there's no listener across these replicas. It's just you connect to this one server that's set up to replicate to another region, maybe West US or East US, and then if there's a failover, what would have to happen is you would actually have to change the connection strings in your application, because these are kind of, there's no listener, like I was saying, they're just kept in sync. But you can have multiple of these. You can even have multiple of these in the same region. You can have them in, a few regions across the globe. So this is really great, and you can use them as readable secondaries as well. Now, if we contrast that with auto failover groups, and I'm actually going to put those both up at the same time, what you get is you actually get a failover group, and you do get this read-write listener and this read-only listener. So instead of connecting to an individual server like you would in geo-replication, you're just going to connect to the read-write listener or the read-only listener. And we're going to take care of pointing you to the primary or the secondary, depending on if you fail over or anything like that. So what this helps with is you can do an automatic failover without having to change any connection strings. Now, the flip side of this is you cannot have multiple of these. You just get one failover group, but you can also use this as a readable secondary. So if we kind of look at comparing them, this is a table that I helped create with a few people to kind of compare, okay, which one should I use for my scenario? Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that geo-replication today isn't available in managed instance. So if you want some sort of globally redundant type of application, auto-failover groups is your only option in managed instance. That will probably change going forward, but right now that's just how it is. We talked about the automatic failover, how that's possible with auto failover groups. With geo-replication, it's going to require some sort of change in connection strings, and you also can't fail over multiple databases simultaneously. We talked about most of these other things. It's really going to depend on your scenario, what's going to be the best thing for you. So I wanted to take a break from the slides and show you kind of what auto failover groups look like in an application. So switch over here. Give me a second to just minimize some things. Let's see. Okay. Ooh, okay. So what I have here is, again, another PowerShell notebook. This is from Module 5 of the workshop, which I'll share resources to, so you can set this up yourself if you want to go through it. But basically what I went ahead and did is I created an auto failover group. You can see it just takes a few commands to get this all set up. And then over here on the right, I have a very simple Java application. And what it's doing is it's inserting a row on the primary listener. So it's just connecting to the listener. So it's inserting a row on the primary, and then it's connecting to the readable listener and trying to read that row it just inserted from the secondary. So this, again, is just a way of querying the different databases availability. So what I can do, and again, I'm not going to go through all of this because it just takes time. So I went ahead and did these things like create a different Azure SQL database server, creating a failover group, those sort of things. And I did do this in Azure SQL database, but it's the same process, just slightly different commands in managed instance. You add databases to the failover group. You make sure you can connect to those databases with things like firewall rules. And then this is kind of what I was talking about. You'll have to set up your application to connect to the failover group name. And then basically what we use is we're connecting to just the main failover group, or we use .secondary.database.windows.net to connect to the read-only endpoint. So this makes it so that in the case of a failover, I don't have to change any connection strings. Okay, so we already ran the application. So what we can do is check the status. So I'm just going to run this. And what this is going to do is it's going to get the failover group based on the name and then say, what's the replication role? And in this case, we're looking at what I called my DR server. So what's the replication role of my DR server? And in this case, it's a secondary. So that means all of these secondary reads are happening on my DR server. So now what I can do, again, very simple Azure PowerShell commands, I can basically say switch in the failover group, specifying that I want the DR server to now become the primary. And I specified the name of the failover group as well. So what you saw over here on the right is for 2 inserts, we weren't able to connect. So this was when we were switching the listener and rerouting you in the backend, you were not able to connect. One thing I hope you take away from this session is how important retry logic is in your applications when you move to Azure, because these blips happen sometimes, changes in connectivity, failovers, whatever, and you don't want to be down just because you had this blip for a few seconds. So there's a lot of documentation on retry logic, but it's very important. But you can see after that we were able to connect. And so now when we connect, we can check the status of the secondary again. Now the secondary is actually, sorry, the DR server is now actually the primary. So again, I just ran that same command, and the replication role of the DR server is now the primary. So all these inserts are happening on the DR server, and we're reading them from the original server. And similarly, we can fail back and go through this same exercise of promoting the main server to be the primary as opposed to the readable secondary. And we'll see a similar thing where it will become momentarily unavailable and we won't be able to do these inserts or reads, and then we'll be back up and running again. So this is, again, an interesting exercise to see how easy it can be to set this up. I imagine, I personally have not had to do this myself, but I imagine setting up a globally redundant application in the on-premises world was a lot more effort than this. I don't know how much more effort. I think probably a lot. Maybe Guy, you've done something like this.
A lot more.
A lot more than 7 Azure PowerShell commands. Of course, there's more complications if you're doing this at an enterprise level, but still, I think it's pretty cool to see how simple this can be. And you can see we're back up and running. I
have a question about the failover groups. So even without the failover group feature, we already have redundancy, right? It's out of the box. If anything happens to the server, it will fail over automatically, transparently. I don't even know about it, maybe. And I use the same connection string. I don't need to change anything. So my question is, why use failover groups? What is the difference? What is the added value of this feature on top of what we have already?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So basically, I think the question is like, hey, you already showed me how I have this like great availability. Why would I need something like an auto failover group? And it really just depends on your scenario. I think one thing that you get, and I would have to check the SLA specifically, is that we do have an SLA for RPO and RTO, like 5 seconds and 30 seconds, I think. But those are dependent on having some sort of geo-replication or auto failover group. So if you wanted to take your SLA, one step higher, this might be an option. Also, one benefit of this is the read scale you get from this. So in this case, this is a business critical database. So already I have an always on availability group and I have a readable replica. But now with this, what I get is I actually get 2 more readables because I get the primary from the failover group listener or the read-only endpoint, and I get the readable replica from that availability group. So one way could be read scale, or maybe you want to kind of scale where your users live. Maybe you have users in 2 main locations around the globe. So there are some reasons why you might want to take advantage of this. I know for geo-replication, it's a lot of scaling where users live and getting that read scale. Does that help?
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Awesome. Cool. Great question.
I have a question, please.
Sure.
About geo-replication, why cannot we add replicas on the same region? For example, we are using West Europe. I want another 1 or 2 copies within West Europe.
Sure. So for geo-replication, you can have a replica in the same region. I'm not sure if you can have more than 1, but I know you can have at least 1. I would have to double check on if you want 2. For auto failover groups, that's just the way that we've set up the architectures, is it has to be across regions. But your point is well noted. We have had, several people comment to us that like, hey, I actually would like my failover group to be in the same region. But today that's just not something that we support.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So we talked about failover groups. So we've talked about a lot of different things, locally, zonal, and geo. Now, you might have to think about what is the right option for you, or what do you use when. So there are a few things you might want to consider. you know, from a backup perspective, how long do you need to be able to restore from? What are your RTO and RPO needs? This kind of is what I was talking about. If you want that SLA, sometimes you have to take it to the next level. Reviewing the Azure SQL SLA is something I think everyone should do, just so you're familiar with the promises we're making, and you know, not only so you can monitor them yourself, but also just so you're aware of the availability we're kind of promising you just by deploying. Do you need read replicas, and how many you need and where they should be might land you in different combinations of using something like business critical versus using general purpose, but a bunch of geo replicas. We talked about geo HADR. And then a big thing that I mentioned briefly was, is your application ready? So for example, we talked about the retry logic, but for example, if I want to have an auto failover group so I can failover to a new region if I need to, it's not enough to just have my database, of course, in both regions. I also need to have some system with an application in that region, because when we move to Azure, if you have your application in one region and your database in another region, that's going to introduce a lot of extra latency that you would really want to avoid, especially in the case of some huge disaster where a whole region goes down. So your application is a big part of this, and we've got lots of guides on how to kind of configure this correctly. Finally, and this is just really brief, I wanted to talk about monitoring availability. There's a lot of things you can monitor when it comes to monitoring your availability. A few things that you didn't necessarily have to monitor before, like your region and data center availability. So there are ways that you can do this. You might want to look at the replica status, or your if you have like geo-replication, or you have business critical, or you have auto failover groups, there are DMVs that you can use to actually check the status of if these are in sync or not. There are ways you can kind of try to investigate failover reasons that you didn't force, your backup restore history, a few other things. But there are lots of tools available for you. Something that's new is something like the service health dashboard and feeds like the Azure status page, which can basically tell you if there's any issues with a region or a given service. This doesn't happen often, but you know, sometimes it's good to be able to monitor these things if you see issues. You can see your resource health in the portal. Azure Monitor has a whole slew of capabilities around log analytics, where you can actually dive deeper into some of these availability logs. There's some other things you can do here. There's a lot of T-SQL. A lot of the T-SQL that you already know related to availability is going to apply here. Like I mentioned, there are a few new DMVs that you can use to monitor, and then there are some command line tools as well. Something we also recently released was the management packs, which were traditionally for SQL Server only. These are now available for Azure SQL DB and Managed Instance, so that can just help generally with monitoring. I just wanted to share that as well. So when we think about all the things we talked about automated backups. We talked about the built-in HA, so really just the power you get just from deploying a certain service tier or deployment options. How you can kind of go further with things like availability zones in business critical and general purpose starting tomorrow, and multi-region high availability with things like geo-replicas and auto failover groups. Talked about the SLA and how you can kind of think about making choices. So we covered a lot in a little bit of time, but I hope it kind of gives you a bigger picture or better picture of what it looks like from our perspective. Lots of resources. Perhaps the most important one is the link to this deck, which is in the bottom right. So then you'll have all these other resources. Just a brief review of what these are. I spend a lot of time doing content development and videos, so a lot of this is, you know, shameless plugs to things that I've done. One is the Azure SQL workshop. This is like a 1 to 2 day workshop. It's all on GitHub. The slides, the labs, everything, all these slides you saw today are part of that. Microsoft Learn. This one's an interesting one, just to show you a brief example of that. This is the Microsoft Learning path that we created. And the wonderful thing about it is if you actually go into, say, the availability module, you can see we cover all the same sort of topics. But one cool thing is you can actually get a sandbox. And so what a sandbox allows you to do, I have to review the permissions, but what a sandbox basically allows you to do is deploy any resource within their scope. So it's mostly like Azure SQL related resources or VMs for a 4-hour period and play with them and go through these labs. You can even get a Cloud Shell right here. You don't have to have any money or a free trial or whatever to do this. You can do, I think, 20 sandboxes a day, which is 40 hours of sandbox in a day, which should be enough for you to play with this thing. So that's a really cool capability there. A few other resources that I'll share are the documentation. We try our best to keep this up to date. There are a lot of things that are changing, so sometimes I always find myself having to do a quick search, Azure SQL Docs, and then my question, and I can find it pretty easily. I'll share a link to Azure SQL for Beginners, which is a 61 video series on Azure SQL. So there's like 10 videos on availability if you want to dive deeper into any of the topics from today. And then I'll also share a link to Data Exposed, which is where you can catch, it's basically a show I host on YouTube and Channel 9 where we bring in program managers, we bring in MVPs, maybe we can convince Guy to come on the show one day. And we talk about cool things related to Azure SQL, SQL Server, even things like Synapse and Power BI. So you can see this is what your kind of work site looks like. There's scripts in here for you to deploy stuff. And I'll put back up those slides. So with that, I really just want to, thank you guys again for having me, and I'm happy to take questions now or later. I'll put my email in the chat. I'm always happy to help, and if I don't know the answer, chances are I know someone who does know the answer, so I will make sure that you get that. So thanks so much. Thanks, Guy, and I'll stick around for questions.
Thank you very much, Anna. I also want to say thank you for the great job that you do in terms of the documentation and the resources. It's really, really great. That's so many resources. I want to tell everyone here, if you want to learn Azure SQL, nothing is stopping you except for time. You need some time, but you got so many great resources. The videos you mentioned and lots of articles and the labs and the learning path. It's really, really great. And go ahead and use them.
Yeah, thanks. We'd love to see you guys use them, and you can file like bugs and stuff if you see stuff that doesn't make sense. Please help us make it better for people like you.
Great. And will you share the presentation with me later?
Yes, yeah, I can share the direct file with you. Yeah, but it's already on my GitHub page if you want to go download it from there. But I'll share it directly with you.
Okay, great. Thanks. I just uploaded it to the Meetup.
Awesome.
Excellent. Any questions? Anyone? Now is the time. Okay. I guess not. Thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.